My name is Terry Gilbert, and I'm a lifelong Clevelander, and I've been a lawyer for, believe it or not, 44 years. I started my career, interestingly enough, working out in South Dakota doing work for the American Indian Movement during the struggle and uprising at Wounded Knee. And then I came back to Cleveland and labeled myself as sort of an activist lawyer, to the extent that you could be an activist lawyer in the context of this system. But my career has been based on mostly criminal justice issues and the inequality and oppression of minorities and other people of color and people disadvantaged economically. Most of the work I've done over the years relates to criminal justice issues, as well as defending people charged with criminal offenses. It's really great to be here. It's great to be at a convening of people who are conscious about what's going on in this country, both now and into the future. And it's great for me as a lawyer because I spend most of my days, in court and dealing with people I don't really like so much and trying to get things done, not always easy, and try to get some justice for people and make a difference. In terms of the struggle to deal with police violence and the struggle to stop and get remedies for people who have been victimized by police violence has a long historical road that we'll talk about today. And just so you know, there's just so much that a lawyer can do in terms of this kind of effort. Any meaningful change in connection with controlling this epidemic of police violence in our communities can only be achieved by activism and radical struggle among the people. And I just want to start my presentation by recalling the year 2014. I'm sure you all know there was a young man named Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, who was shot and killed after he walked away from a police officer he was unarmed and did not pose a threat, and he was shot at least 6 times. That case, and there have been many others, set off a chain reaction around this country regarding the epidemic of shooting and killing young African Americans. People took to the streets. People took to the streets and were met with literally a military response by the local and regional governments. Many people were injured, hundreds of people arrested. A prosecutor convened a grand jury, but he took it upon himself to decide there would be no charges. The governor declared a state of emergency, called out the National Guard. The New York Times wrote an article about the fears of white people, and the KKK announced it was ready to use lethal force. This was the setting in the year 2014, just a few years ago. And around this time, and I tried to track a period of a couple years, we had Michael Brown, we had Freddie Gray in Baltimore, which set off a tremendous amount of community reaction where blocks of that city were burned down. Obviously, Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old boy who was shot, who only had a toy gun. Melissa Williams and Timothy Russell. Timothy Russell's family were my clients. the 137 shot case, where a 35-minute police chase of 60 cars cornered them in a school in East Cleveland and opened fire, with one of the officers getting on the roof and firing 49 shots into the window. Eric Gardner in New York, who on video was choked to death over selling cigarettes on the street. Walter Scott shot in the back in Charleston, South Carolina. This is all 2013, 2014, 2015. Laquan McDonald in Chicago. Philando Castile in Minnesota, who was in his car, did everything the police asked him to do, went to pull out his wallet and was shot in front of his wife and a child. And here recently in the last year, Luke Stewart, who was sleeping in a vehicle in Euclid and approached at 6 o'clock in the morning, and two cops tried to drag him out of the car. He panicked and decided to drive away, was tased, beaten, and shot 5 times at close range in his head and neck, 24 years old. Young black men in this country are 21 times more likely to be shot and killed than white victims of police violence. In 2015, 1,140 people were killed by police, and about a third of those people were unarmed. Something's going on here. And while the killing of people of color in America is not unique in our history, and yes, we have seen at different periods of time, people fed up with this and marching in the streets and demanding justice. But it seems to be in our lifetime right now, in this period, to be an unusually extreme situation where we're essentially, our communities are an occupied force of police who have unfettered powers and engage in people and violate their rights on a systematic basis. So I think it's really important, though, to show how we kind of got to this place. It just didn't happen in a vacuum. Some of us are old enough to remember right here in Cleveland in 1968, the Glenville riots, where the city of Cleveland, certain areas of the city of Cleveland on the east side were burned. There were 9 dead, 18 hurt, people jailed. So this is nothing new. It's part of our history. And there was a flash of very visible struggle back then with black nationalist groups, civil rights leaders pushing back on police brutality to the extent that even the government got involved, particularly around the time of the Chicago 1968 Democratic Convention, where the Chicago police showed their true colors in basically engaging in a rampage against the protesters outside the convention hall, beating people senselessly, and hundreds of them. And it was horrifying because most of the people who were protesters who were being beaten were white college youth. And that caught the attention on the radar of what's going on here. But all this was going on in the context of a war that was unpopular and a civil rights movement, visibly by Martin Luther King, but a whole lot of others, that led to the formation of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders in 1968 called the Kerner Commission, which has a pretty powerful quote in the report that I put up here on the PowerPoint, that to some Negroes, the police have come to symbolize white power, white racism, white repression, and supremacist attitudes. So, I mean, that kind of language was even in the lexicon back in 1968. Sound familiar? Of course. But regardless of all the work of that commission and other commissions, nothing was really done to change the culture of police, to change the legal structure that deals with police, and things continued. The good news around that time is that, at least from a legal standpoint, various legal organizations took up the call to deal with police brutality, police misconduct, and realized that there was a role for the courts to play to deal with this, the legal system. The legal system is only one tool, as I said earlier, to deal with it, but an important tool because if you can reach certain judges, certain courts to address these kinds of issues, it's a positive thing. Some of you may not agree with that, but back at that time, I became a lawyer in the 70s. There was no such thing as a police brutality lawsuit, because it was almost impossible to bring a case against the police, not only from the available remedies that were available that we could use at the time, but the judges, the courts, and the juries were so heavily biased against people of color in terms of legal redress, and also not receptive to the idea that the police can do any wrong. The police are the guardians. They're the ones that we were taught to respect and obey as we grew up. They can do no wrong. So it was like a wall, a legal wall preventing us from using the courts to be able to do anything regarding police misconduct. But slowly, mainly through the work of these organizations I mentioned around the country, there started to be an opening, and the opening kind of took place in the context of the Warren Court back then. The last liberal court, U.S. Supreme Court, that we've had up until this day. We've never seen a court. That's when the decisions Miranda came in, the right to challenge searches and seizures, and other issues that started to matriculate through the lower courts and then the Supreme Court. And in particular, with the use of force, these cases here opened the door for asserting that there was a constitutional violation when police used excessive force, and it was understood to be under the contour of the Fourth Amendment, unconstitutional seizure. And so the civil rights lawyers picked up on this and began bringing lawsuits. But it really didn't become something that had a real possible opening until the Rodney King case in 1994. Rodney King was being chased by the police in LA, and he was dragged out of his car by 5 cops who beat the shit out of him with clubs on the side of the road. But somebody had a video, and captured it. So this was the first video of police violence, and it shocked the community, and it shocked the country, and it resonated all around the world. And in that case, they charged the 5 cops, and despite the fact that it was clear what they were doing, I mean, there was absolutely no room to argue that they had any reasonable justification to beat him. They went to trial in a suburban LA County court, and with an all-white jury were acquitted. Fortunately, the Justice Department took up the call, and it did an investigation under the Federal Criminal Civil Rights Act, which was rarely used. It was a law that was passed in the 19th century after the 14th Amendment was enacted or amended to the Constitution, and they were eventually convicted in a federal prosecution. But one thing that really happened, what was happening around that time in the late 80s and early 90s was, and gives you an understanding why this happened with Rodney King, was that the war on drugs was being stepped up. And the war on drugs was not a Republican or a conservative response to the drug problem, which really is a health problem and never should be criminalized to the extent that it was. Eventually led, under Bill Clinton, to a massive restructuring of the federal criminal code that took away a lot of power from the states to the federal government in terms of dealing with violent and drug crimes. This resulted in more police, the development of the militarization of police with SWAT teams, task forces, and they were going into the communities under the guise of, ferreting out drugs in our communities, most of which were coming in through the help of the government, and that's another story. But that's when this police state mentality kind of developed in the most blatant way. And in fact, the Rodney King brought about also a movement of some sort, a spontaneous eruption of activism, and there were riots in LA. There were cries in Congress for some reforms, and as a result, we had a law called the Pattern and Practice Act, which allowed the Justice Department to actually go after police departments who had a history of problems, particularly in the use of force, to get a court to take control of a police department with the monitors, with people who are requiring oversight and that kind of thing. But it was also a time when, sorry, what am I doing here? Citizens review boards or police review boards were being developed to try to get some accountability, I suppose, in the communities. But they have been a pretty dismal failure. I remember in Cleveland, we had a group of activists that lobbied hard to put on the ballot a charter amendment in the city of Cleveland to set up a police review board. But it turned out to be a review board that had police on it. And also, it had no enforcement power. It couldn't subpoena witnesses. When a complaint was brought about police misconduct by a citizen, if that person was arrested and beaten and charged, well, if they went in and gave a statement, they would then use it against them maybe in the criminal case. There was also no teeth to the recommendations, even if they sustained a complaint, because then it went to the chief and the safety director to decide whether they want to follow the recommendations. And then the legislature passed a law, said if you made a statement to the police, even if it's for a complaint and they think it's false, then they could charge you with a misdemeanor. So they're basically telling people, don't bother, you know. But people continue because they're victims. They're frustrated. They want to get some kind of response and accountability, and so some of them actually do file complaints. In 2011, 83% said that their complaint was not investigated thoroughly. 82% said they were not informed of the status of their review. 73% said their complaint was not handled in a timely manner. 61% felt that the process didn't give full opportunity to present their complaints. Here's a startling statistic, though. A 2007 report of 4,427 investigations by superior officers between 2003 and 2006, all, without an exception, found in favor of the police. This is in between 2000 and 2006. The Plain Dealer did a review of 400 reports and found that there was no real discipline for anybody. At worst, they may ask them to get some retraining or something like that, or maybe a reprimand. So what we had in Cleveland, and I'm talking about Cleveland because I know about it, but this was going on around the country. So you could see here the system, even though there were eruptions of condemnation against the way police are used in our society, and there were glimpses of some hope represented to the people through some changes in laws and that kind of thing. I mean, for the most part, there were false promises and didn't really achieve anything. And so this continued on and on and on. And in Cleveland, like everywhere else, there were high-profile police shootings. And this was the 2012 137 shot case that I mentioned earlier with Melissa Williams and Timothy Russell. If this had happened in New York, it would be the crying call for action back in 2012. It did not get the kind of attention that we had hoped. But in Cleveland, it resonated, particularly in the black community. I mean, two people in a car over a muffler that they claimed sounded like a shot, driving on St. Clair right across from the Justice Center, which results in literally half the police department involved in a chase that went from Cleveland, downtown Cleveland, to the west side, onto the Shoreway, all the way out to East Cleveland, into East Cleveland, and wound up at a school. And this is a picture of the vehicle with the number, you see those numbers there? That's only about half of the numbers. The cops were shooting from all sides. I mean, it was like, it made Bonnie and Clyde look like nothing. And then this one cop, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but the one cop got up there and shot 49 of those shots while on the hood into the vehicle. And so you could see here our friends from Cleveland out there in front of City Hall, you know, creating a stir about what should be done. And then, of course, we had the Tamir Rice case, where this vehicle they get a call that there was a kid waving a gun at Cudell Park. And a police cruiser shows up, but instead of backing off and not, using some kind of de-escalation techniques and assess the situation, pulls right in front of the kid, and they see him with the gun. Within seconds, the passenger cop gets out and shoots him, and then leaves him to suffer for a long time because they didn't give him medical attention. A grand jury was convened. The county prosecutor, Tim McGinty, notoriously supported by the police, during that process released secret information from the grand jury to favor the police officer, particularly some expert opinions. Neither officer was charged. There was a settlement. The officer was fired, by the way, but not because of the shooting. It was because he lied on his application to get the job. But getting back to the Melissa Williams and Timothy Russell situation, Brelo, I'm sure it's a name that for those who are from Cleveland know, actually was charged. One of the first times a police officer was charged with manslaughter, not only, and never happened in Cleveland, and probably hadn't happened much, if at all, around the country. This was a big deal. And people were encouraged by that because they thought, how could he not be convicted for what he did? So he gets charged, and there's a trial, but not before a jury, because you can waive a jury and have the case tried by a judge who has to be elected every 6 years. And he is acquitted. The day that he was acquitted was a Memorial Weekend of 2015. And that day, people took to the streets in Cleveland. Many were on East 4th, and it was a Cavs game that night. And so obviously the police had, I think it was a playoff game actually, and the police did not want any trouble for all those Cavs fans who were paying hundreds and hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars for tickets and eating on East 4th Street. So they came out in full force and arrested a bunch of people, and then cornered 70 other people on Johnson Court between West 6th and West 9th, telling them that they had to leave, but when they went to one side, they couldn't get through because the police wouldn't let them. When they went to the other side, the police wouldn't let them in, but they arrested them anyway for failure to disperse. So the ACLU, National Lawyers Guild, some lawyers from the NAACP, good thing to get lawyers, progressive lawyers in Cleveland to come together to do anything in a united way has always been a problem for us. But we were able to get a number of lawyers together, pro bono, who represented many of these people. All the cases were dismissed, and we had 6 that sued actually, and we settled it just recently for $50,000. Each of them got close to $10,000 for spending a day or two at the old aviation high school that they made a makeshift jail in inhuman conditions, poor, no sanitation, no food. So we were able to and then when we met with the chief of police and his deputy, the deputy said, we asked the deputy, why didn't you get these people out on bail? So why did they have to sit 3 days in jail? He says, because if we let them out, they would go back and protest again. So what is the future of police reform? And I don't want to, make this seem trite and all that, but we can't give up on this. I mean, as difficult as this is, we have to keep out there, and the theme of this conference is that in spite of the dismal climate that we live in, we have to continue to fight on. So, I mean, the most important thing is the community involvement, meaningful oversight systems, use of civil actions, collaborative agreements with the community where the community actually is at the table when deciding, protocols and rules of engagement for police, early warning detection systems where problematic cops can be red flagged if they see a number of complaints or incidents that could raise some question. Well, better funding for Justice Department Civil Rights Division, that went out the window as soon as Trump came in, and William Sessions. Better hiring practice and minority recruiting, which has been a problem for 30 years, and more training. This is the law that allows the Justice Department to go in and intervene. And in March of 2013, in the context of the Melissa Williams, Timothy Russell disaster, the Justice Department under Obama announced that it opened up an investigation into the Cleveland police. And in December of 2014, less than a week after Tamir Rice was shot and killed, they issued a finding where they found that the Justice Department found that there was reasonable cause to believe that Cleveland Police Department engages in a pattern or practice of using unreasonable force in violation of the Fourth Amendment. And it was a devastating attack on the Cleveland Police Department. They were forced into a consent decree, which is now being enforced by the federal court in Cleveland, Judge Oliver. And, but as Dr. Rhonda would tell you, because she was on one of the aspects of this settlement where they created a community police commission, it has not been easy to get any reforms. And we're now on 2.5, 3 years. They have done some mental health training and some diversity training, but the biggest problem is accountability. And things are not getting better in terms of holding accountable police officers who do wrong. Another area that needs reform is the grand jury process. Every case, just about every case that we've seen, except for the Brelo case, grand juries, they call a grand jury, they get everybody's hopes up high that they're going to really, get indictments for police who unjustifiably, use excessive force or deadly force, and invariably nothing comes out of it. We wrote an article, an op-ed piece for the Plain Dealer about why that happens. And you know, the problem is the number one, the investigation of these shootings are biased to begin with. And we've dealt with this in court all the time. The investigators come out on the scene. The police do not have to give a statement about what happened. They have 3, 4, 5 days to a week to get their stories straight with their union lawyers and with their union representatives. They do not give credence to any witness statements. And then the grand jury is a tool of the prosecutor. And the grand juries, they work with the police all the time. They don't understand the dynamics of how police operate because they're foggy and biased, and because they work with the police and they support the police, so they give them the benefit of the doubt. And what's really going on right now is most of the cases that we've seen could have been prevented if they just use common sense, de-escalation tactics, proper approaches, think about what they're going to do beforehand, and not put themselves in a position where there's an unnecessary confrontation with somebody that leads to the use of deadly force, which is what we see over and over again in our cases. So the grand jury is something that needs to be reformed. You know how long it takes to indict somebody if they're just you and me? Like 5 minutes, right? Cop goes into the grand jury room, reads a police report, and a person is charged with a criminal offense, and they're picked up or they're brought to trial. The police investigation goes on for months and months and months. No one knows what's going on. The family of the victims are in agony because no one will tell them anything because it's secret. And then all of a sudden they're called in and say, by the way, we're not indicting the police. So it's another sham in terms of this process. Yes.
Can you speak to the, I think it was the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals that talked about that you can't consider anything, you can't use 20/20 hindsight to evaluate an officer's behavior, that split-second decision where they believe that their life is in danger or in danger of serious injury, and the role that plays in grand juries failing to indict officers.
Well, this is a very complicated legal question because it's not just the Sixth Circuit, it's the U.S. Supreme Court regarding 20/20 hindsight and split-second decisions. It's an objective standard that is not, but it's not what the cop says he felt at the time of the shooting. It's an objective standard. What would a reasonable officer do under the circumstances? But that was a civil case. It wasn't a criminal case. And one of the things that I've been arguing when I speak about this is that there's really no language, there's no legal offenses that deal with police misconduct. It's like murder, manslaughter. There's no statutes that specifically deal with misconduct by the police with criminal motive. And I think what happens, sometimes in these grand juries, the jurors don't understand how to apply the law, and it just is impossible to get at the cop unless they are absolutely out of control. But the idea of deadly force seems to work in favor of the police officer in these proceedings. That's when we step into it. With the civil cases, which, we bring these cases and we get judgments or settlements that show that the police did violate the Constitution. But that shouldn't be it shouldn't just be getting them money. It should be getting justice for the family and having those officers personally held accountable for what they did. Because when the administrative part goes into effect, where they actually look and see if they violated any policies, they never fire the cops. They never really do anything to them. So it's a big problem.
I'd like to speak to several bullet points that you made. You mentioned the 2011 article about the exoneration of officers and the use of force. There also has been an impasse because of people like Greg White. Your experience of dealing with the McGinty and O'Malley, and the experience of many officers within the last 24 to 36 months, 8 have either had to resign or give up their badge through a plea agreement or were prosecuted for felony or gross sexual imposition or rape and what have you. Now, being that this impasse in the city has hired Greg White, which you've known to be a Stonewaller in the past, and your other experience, as I look in Mrs. Mitchell's eyes, I remember the Michael Pipkins case.
Right.
Many of these individuals, as Michael Pipkins, person who killed him, Tankersley, is now a first-class detective in the 1st District. And as we look on Channel 20 on cable, many of those who receive promotion have 6 to 8 kills. But what I want you to speak on, and I provided a background, is the insidious, incestuous, familial relationship. When we talk about reform, there is an overriding, co-opting process of a subculture of family. We brought in Willie Williams in LA, racketeering, rape, mayhem, robbery with the police department. We've had reforms. I'm not discounting reforms.
Right.
But how do we undermine? As you know, the police chief now is worked on the SWAT unit with McGrath.
Yeah.
As you well may know, the assistant safety director, Martin Flash, was involved in a drug scandal in the past. So what I'm saying is, when we talk about reforms, we have a relationship that is personal.
Okay, well, that's good.
The last thing I'm going to say this, that Jacqueline Green, basically, I had spoke with her about a year ago over at the law school where they were screening the 13th. I asked her the question. She said, basically, the issue around the consent, they're fucked up. They haven't did a goddamn thing. They don't intend to do it, and they're stonewalling.
Right. So
and she says that the federal government right now has retreated in that area, and the city is really stonewalling, and they really don't give a fuck.
Okay,
what is
so
your assessment
let me respond. Okay, you have added to what I've said all along about how scandalous the whole situation is.
I'm talking about the subculture.
Yeah, but culture is hard to change.
Okay.
You could pass reforms. You could have the consent decree. You can have Judge Oliver, by the way, on Tuesday is holding a hearing in federal court. I didn't get to that slide, where he called McGrath in to be in court to respond to why the Office of Professional Standards is not doing their job. Okay, and so it's always been understood that to get any real fundamental change is going to take a generation.
What do you mean by that?
Because the culture of the police, it's a long discussion, but the culture of these police departments are ingrained into being racist, to feel that they can get away with whatever they do. There's corruption. I understand, but that's going to. You could change the policies. You can get more training, and it will do good. But you got to weed out the bad blood that's been insidiously percolating through that department for generations. Next question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a retired teacher who used to teach street law, and I've seen Terry in court twice cross-examine police officers, and it's not pretty. So I think you should all, in a good way. Terry is relentless, and so that's something to observe. We used to take the kids down to the Justice Center and observe some of the trials. And if you're young in here and you haven't seen a trial, just walk down there someday to the Justice Center, walk through and walk up to a trial and watch and see what you see. But I want to ask you about William Kunstler in just a minute, but I want to run through 3 books and see if you're aware of them, but I would advise them. First of all, someone named Rothstein has written a book called The Color of Law. I am retired. You don't have time to read. I don't know if you know these books yet. They're just very current. And it lays out the historical background of the FHA, the GI Bill, and what else? The Veterans Administration. And it's this program we're seeing, Divided by Design, on public radio right now. And it explains the context historically about how America was deliberately segregated, not by the banks, not by the real estate companies, but by the federal government's maps of redlining. And that's too deep. The second book, the 2 other books that come out are Chokehold Policing by an attorney, a Harvard attorney named Butler, and then I Can't Breathe by a journalist like Matt Taibbi, and that's both about the Eric Garner case. And Michelle Alexander, who wrote The New Jim Crow, sat with Butler, and they both decided that black young men in the city have no constitutional rights, which even struck me as pretty profound. And so I just wanted to lay that on you. And then I wanted to go back, I guess.
Do you have a question?
Well, are you familiar with, I'd recommend everybody look at those books, though, because to me, there's a young generation of historians and lawyers coming up who are writing stuff that shocks me, and I've been in this for quite a while. Do you know those books yet, or do you have time?
Well, of course I know Michelle Alexander's book.
Yeah, but the 3 current ones are.
Yeah. But anyway, it all works, this whole thing with the police, the courts, the prisons, it's all part of one systematic prison industrial police complex. It's to control the population.
Yeah, but I would say that if anybody wants to look at the Chokehold Policing and I Can't Breathe, those 2 books are new. But what I wanted to ask
well,
you,
we heard it.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about William Kunstler's role. I know you went out west and you defended people.
I can talk to you about that later. Because we don't have a lot of time.
There's a lawyer that did a lot.
Yeah, he did. He was my mentor. Okay.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I want everybody to be able to talk.
I just wanted to comment on, we had Brelo and 5 other police officers in the Cleveland atrocity, 137 shots. I've talked to Jackie, I've talked to a couple other people in terms of being an activist to try to figure out what we're going to do in case the Cleveland Review Board is dismantled, which I was told it would happen in 2019, but only if, somebody can send a thing that maybe we still need to continue. So I was relieved at that to some extent.
Right.
But Don Freeman, a mentor of mine, had said one of the things he was trying to do maybe about 12 months ago was to get Frank Jackson to fire the 5 police, and right after that they did. And I said, well, that's a little something. But then I was stunned, which was what we had said would happen when it was about a month ago.
Yeah.
They had the arbitrator come in, sit down with the arbitrator, and these guys got reinstated. And that's the one thing that has made me as mad as I was in the 60s about this, that they actually did that right in our face. The other thing, I would like you to comment on this. When Angela Davis came, she said something that stunned me, mainly because I had never thought about it. And then I mentioned it, and people looked like I was speaking Plutonian or something. She said the abolishment of the police. And just to consider the idea was almost unthinkable.
Right.
Instead of reform. Because Philando Castile and Paul Hammond in Utah show you the extent to what body cams and dash cams will do for evidence. Nothing.
Right. And, even when there's a video they come up with some bullshit reason to justify what they did. So that's why I say, to do this kind of work, all of us as activists and progressive lawyers is frustrating. It's frustrating and it's debilitating, but you can't give up. And once again, I would encourage you to go to federal court on Tuesday at 2 o'clock and show your face and be there just to watch the cross-examination of Michael McGrath as to why he hasn't done shit regarding this police review board. I mean, and the Office of Professional Standards. Why aren't they processing these complaints? Yes, sir.
So I have a question about the interplay between the civil and the criminal justice systems. Because understanding your career has been as a criminal defense lawyer, you know that there are collateral consequences, collateral civil legal consequences which occur from folks that have been convicted of crimes. Could you speak to what your sense is of how court-appointed counsel or even the public defender's office, how they understand and carry out that duty to folks that are being tried in the criminal context, and how they make their clients aware of the collateral consequences that may come after?
Well, I think many of the public defenders sometimes get a bad rap. People say, I want a real lawyer. And I found that I'd rather have a public defender represent me than a court-appointed lawyer, because the court-appointed lawyers only get like $50 an hour, and all they want to do is get the person pled out. So public defenders aren't so bad; they're just overworked. As to collateral consequences, this is a big deal, because what we see for most people who are charged with crimes, they don't necessarily go to prison. They're stuck in this agonizing, revolving door of probation violations, and having to do to comply with the conditions where, because of family life and work, they can't always make it to see their probation officer, or they get a dirty urine, all that, so they get caught in this system. But there are moves, and there have been some moves in the state legislature to provide for some relief, but not far enough. Once you get a record, man, you're screwed for life, totally. And Charles C., my good friend from reentry program, and people like Brandon Stock, what's his name? The guy from Edwin's, can't pronounce his name. There are a lot of good programs, but the system needs to be in a position to protect these people once they've done their time, once they're out of prison, once they're out of probation, to help them. And the employers have to be open-minded too. But it's not enough. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you.
But it's a big problem.
I'm interested in your personal observations about the study of the DC police that showed body cameras make no difference.
Yeah, I haven't read that study, but anecdotally, I know that there are, it may be too early, actually, to know how effective they are. I think that people in the community who video with their phones police encounters is more effective, frankly, than body cams, because they control when they turn them on and turn them off, and because of these close encounters, you can't really tell what's going on. So you're right. I think it's not so effective, but at least it should have some deterrence for some of these cops to think twice before they do something.
It was interesting to me that they waited to do this study until after the DC police had been closely supervised by the DOJ under a consent decree for more than 10 years.
All right. Good point.
I've been attending the Citizens Police Review Board as a public member, and in the last meeting, the Cleveland Division of Police representative was there. All 1,200 police officers will have body cams, and they don't have the option of turning it on and off at will. They turn it off at the start of duty, and they turn it off at the end of duty. Not to say that that's a perfect system or that it can't be abused, but I think there is some progress being made, and I'd rather have a police officer have a body cam than not.
If you're going to have a choice, obviously, and they should be wearing them when they're in their off-duty jobs in uniform, because that's a lot of off-duty. We had Kenny Smith, who was killed by an off-duty cop, the rapper on Prospect and East 9th. Yeah, it was an execution.
And he's still working right down the job.
Yep.
So I have a question. I want to come back to Tamir and something that you said, just to correct the record. And I see this happen a lot. People talk about how the police officers pulled up and, shot him, saw him with a gun and shot him, and it was a toy gun. But this toy gun was never out of his jacket. There was nothing visual there for them to even see.
I didn't say he pulled it.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
No, but it's constantly. I mean, I just see it all the time, and it's really important because they use that. They use the focus on the toy gun, and there was nothing that they saw, of course, from there. But in any case, you also pointed out it was a week after Tamir's death that we finally, got this agreement, that they were going to settle. And yet, as much as some of us, among folks who really work to try and get some acknowledgement for policy and practice change in the consent decree around youth interactions with police, we couldn't do that. Now, we've been still trying to do that in other ways, but I guess my question to you as an attorney who's practicing, what do you think, I have ideas about this, but what do you think we need to be doing to recognize the very unique relationship that police have in terms of power and our young people, the very unique position that young people are in developmentally, and so the unique kinds of protections and policies we need in place in that scenario?
Yeah, so we seem to generalize the police problem into, police and the community, but there are special communities that need to be dealt with because of their unique circumstances. And the two that I can think of are juveniles, because the juvenile system is really, really horrible. And we can go into a lot of reasons for that. And mental health. This is something that's very dear to me in terms of what I'm trying to do legally. We have a case going to the Supreme Court, hopefully, for Michael Arrington Bay, who died in the Bedford Heights jail, Shaker Heights grad. And basically he was left in a room for 8 hours while he was in a floridly psychotic episode. That he had pills on him that his mother had told them the police were for bipolar, and they ignored that. They didn't screen him. They never called a nurse. They never called the doctor, who, by the way, was overseeing 20 jails and working full-time in an emergency room. We won that case in the lower court, and then when it got to the Sixth Circuit, and we had 3 judges, all of whom were reactionaries, say, well, they wouldn't have known if the guy was mentally ill to do anything about it. So this mental health issue is big because a lot of the confrontations with people, and I've seen this over and over again, are because police do not know how to keep their distance and de-escalate a situation, bring the proper resources to the call, not just rush in and try to take them into custody. That only leads to tragedy.
What about the unlawful restraint of Mr. Arrington Bay? What we see is a horse collar maneuver or a full Nelson body slam, then we put him in restraint.
Right.
And then there was an issue of that he was 240 pounds, was a former scholastic record. So when we look at mental health, what would you consider improper, unlawful restraint? Because
Well, by law, you're not supposed to do prone restraints, but they do it all the time.
Just for the record, I asked about kids.
Oh, kids. Yeah, so the other thing with juveniles, you don't know enough about it. All I could say in terms of the police encounters, we had that one case that Subodh Chandra had where I forgot the name of the young boy who had some disabilities, was attacked and thrown on a hood of a car. That raised the question. But I'm not sure I know that we tried to get the youth part into the consent decree. In fact, we had a group of lawyers that filed to intervene on that. It was rejected by Judge Oliver. But as to the specific issues of what the reforms are, I really can't address that. You might know more about it than I do. Okay. I'll be honest about it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I didn't know until she just said that no gun was seen in Tamir Rice. And so you all may not know this. Melissa Williams in particular and Timothy Russell, too, probably were mentally ill, as we haven't mentioned Tanisha Anderson, who they called for because she was mentally ill. I used to be a mentally ill case manager, and I had 62 clients on a caseload where I was supposed to have 20, and they were intensive schizophrenics, which got broke down into intensive. So the police have no idea about mental illness.
Right. But that's one area that the monitor for the consent decree has been successful in initiating, so that's a good thing. Anyway, I think it's a little late here. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. If you have any questions, feel free to come up and ask me.